Hello and welcome to Procurement Office Hours, sponsored by Zycus. My name is Richard Waugh, and I'll give you a little bit of background on myself. I'm Vice President of Corporate Development at Zycus, and as mentioned here, have a lot of history in the B2B commerce space, so been involved in some of the earliest iterations of tools like Procure-to-Pay or sourcing tools. Today, our topic for office hours is what P2P needs to be, must-haves and wish lists to transform Procure-to-Pay. So with the office hours, it's our opportunity to really start a dialogue and solicit some of your top-of-mind kind of questions about Procure-to-Pay. And we get those in advance, and during this session, I hope to address as many of those questions as I can and share some information to hopefully, provide the answers to those burning questions about what P2P needs to be and what your must-haves and wish lists include during the session today. So, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I got a number of great questions to respond to about what P2P needs to be. And, I'll preface those comments by saying I think we are very much in a renaissance in Procure-to-Pay. The first e-procurement or P2P solutions really came on the market around the turn of the century, if you will, 1998-99 timeframe. And those early incantations of Procure-to-Pay really suffered from relatively low adoption because they lacked usability. Therefore, many of the early adopters didn't realize the benefits in their ROI business case that they really had targeted. But with P2P 2.0, that renaissance that's going on today, there are a lot of new innovations, a lot of pent-up demand for users looking for more intuitive, easier to use solutions, driving higher adoption, driving greater return on investment as well. So that's really the pretext for our discussion today is where does P2P need to be? Where are we going with P2P 2.0? And where does it need to take us in the future? So I want to start first, there's a question just about how are businesses educating their stakeholders proactively on cloud adoption. I think this is actually one of the easiest ones these days. Certainly when SaaS solution, software as a service, or cloud, if you prefer that term, first came on the market, there may have been concerns about security or pushback from IT. I think the reality today is that any organization looking to deploy a solution like P2P would need an overwhelming argument why not to use a cloud solution, because they are the predominant, it is the predominant model in the marketplace. And in terms of educating stakeholders, I think that this task is made so much easier by the fact that so many of your end user stakeholders are already using cloud applications in their day-to-day lives as consumers. They're shopping on Amazon, they're booking their vacation trips through an online travel site. So that expectation is already ingrained. The users expect that it's cloud, it's ubiquitous, increasingly expecting the enterprise applications to be available on their mobile devices just the same way they are on a laptop or a desktop. And so really this problem, if you will, I think has gone by the wayside. The cloud is clearly the delivery mode of choice to get accelerated benefits, to speed implementation cycles, to minimize support required from internal IT organizations. And as far as end user stakeholders, as I say, they're already so familiar with easy-to-use consumer-type applications. It's more a matter of how do we meet their expectations that an enterprise solution for P2P be just as easy to use as an Amazon purchase transaction, or if I want to go make a search to find a product or service in my enterprise P2P tool, that the search be as easy to use as a Google search, as an example. So I think that one we've come certainly a long way, and cloud is the de facto standard in today's environment. So the next question was sort of, what are some of the new developments or capabilities on the horizon for P2P? You know, what does best in class or best practice look like? And here I want to share some information from the Hackett Group to try to really address what is state of the art with P2P today. And they've identified 3 characteristics of the top performing P2P organizations. And those 3 characteristics are, number one, sort of a customer centricity, a focus on stakeholders. You know, as I mentioned earlier, the bar has been raised. The expectations from end users are based on their consumer experience with cloud applications in their day-to-day lives. So they're looking for ease of use. The second characteristic is information digitization, so true visibility and process transparency across the organization to enable better strategic decision-making, to take away the manual steps and handoffs in the process, have a seamless flow of data. And last but not least, of course, is that process automation that takes fundamentally a transactional process, more operational or tactical if you prefer, and through automation really offers the procurement function the potential to be much more strategic, to add greater value to the business, because that transactional activity of processing and approving requisitions, delivering POs, matching POs to invoices and goods receipt to execute payment on the back end. With automation in those transactional steps in the business, procurement is freed up to be more strategic. So just to give you a little bit more perspective on what each of those characteristics entail, we're talking about focusing on stakeholders. It's really about having a purchasing process that guides users in the right direction. And one way to measure the effectiveness of that process is what percentage of your spend is through the preferred channel, meaning on contract with an approved vendor, the right buy-pay process, meaning usually on PO, and having the PO matched to the invoice and goods receipt with a 3-way match on the back end. So top performing organizations are getting the vast majority, 85%, of transactions going through the preferred channels, because they're able to effectively steer their users, guide users through the right process to the right approved contracted vendors, as compared to the average performing organization at just 61%. And that self-service capability, so guided buying on the front end to steer users through the search and requisition and order process, empowering them to complete that transaction without intervention by the procurement function, that also self-service extends to the back end of the process as well. So the culmination of purchase to pay, of course, is actually an approved invoice that results in remittance to the supplier, a payment. And even on that back end, self-service includes external stakeholders as well. So suppliers being able to go in through a portal and actually check on their own invoice approval or payment status without having to trouble the accounts payable group with those phone calls and inquiries. So in that case, top performers are twice as likely to be able to have suppliers check their own invoice approval and payment status through a self-service capability. So focus on stakeholders, really not just internal stakeholders, but external stakeholders, suppliers as well, being one of the key characteristics of, this P2P 2.0, if you will. The next one in the area of information digitization is really the strategic benefit that procurement can gain by deploying a P2P solution, in that by having those transactions flow through the approved channel, through the prescribed P2P solution, they get better visibility to the spend data. And top performing organizations have almost twice as much visibility at a very granular level, so they can identify not just the aggregate spend with a particular supplier or within a category, but down at a line item level, by supplier, by item, exactly what's being purchased to really inform their strategic sourcing efforts. Another area where information digitization plays a strong role here is by being able to link the P2P process with the contract management process to ensure contract compliance. So here again is an area where top performing organizations are getting a clear majority, better than 2/3 of their spend on contract, so compliance spend, versus just 44%, less than half, for the average performer or the peer group overall. And then finally, when we look at process automation, it's really about taking friction out of the process through digitization, through a paperless approach. And top performing organizations, again, have far superior results, where better than 1.5 times higher use of the touchless order process. So an end user goes in into the P2P portal and on a self-service basis creates a requisition, has it automatically routed for approval, resulting in a touchless PO. Touchless meaning the procurement function did not have to intervene at all, because the entire process is compliant. They're making a purchase from an approved contracted vendor on catalog or on contract, and on budget too. So results in a touchless order, and much higher likelihood that the top performers are also getting electronic invoices. So electronic requisitions, POs, almost 4 times greater volume of electronic invoices for top performers. And at the end of the day, too, they're doing a better job of getting those e-invoices that accelerate the overall accounts payable invoice approval and payment process, hitting a much higher benchmark in terms of on-time payments at 90% versus less than 80% for the average performer overall. So those are some of the key characteristics that top-performing P2P organizations are focused on. So another question, is it really more cost-efficient to set your company up like this, meaning to deploy a P2P solution, a best practice process, a best-of-breed solution for P2P, and why? So here again, I wanted to bring in some of the benchmark data available that Hackett's put together, and looking at both sides of P2P, both Ps, if you will, the first one being the purchase and the second being the payment. There are some very tangible and material benefits and cost efficiencies that are available through this approach. So the answer is overwhelmingly yes. If you look at the purchasing side, increasing order productivity on the order of 40% through approaches like touchless POs and self-service and user access. Dramatic increases in spend compliance on the indirect side, so 20% increase in indirect spend, and for every dollar of spend that's brought into compliance, on average a 9% savings. So it's pretty easy to see for organizations of any size, a 20% increase in indirect spend that's compliant that yields 9% savings for every dollar that's brought into compliance is going to have a dramatic bottom line impact. And there's also ancillary benefits to be gained around sort of data maintenance, 15% fewer master data records and maintenance costs, just getting better information about the items that you're buying through catalogs or on contracts, and having more of the supplier information maintenance performed on a self-service basis by the suppliers themselves drives down the overall maintenance cost, and 35% more spend with line item visibility. So dramatic benefits on the first P, the purchasing side. Likewise, on the payment side or payables transformation, productivity improvement of almost 2.5 times and a much higher first pass match rate, 20% improvement, meaning fewer exceptions to manage on the AP side, more of those transactions flowing through on the first pass, and better control over payment, better working capital management, whether that means implementing a strategy to maximize early pay discounts or to try to extend days payable outstanding to really hold on to that cash longer. Either case, the visibility that comes with a P2P process like this can enable a much more effective working capital management strategy. So lots of cost efficiencies equally distributed, if you will, between the purchase side and the AP side. So the next question, how do you integrate credit card or P cards with your existing P2P solution? Really good question, because for a long time these two things were sort of viewed as being mutually exclusive. That a P card program in many cases was used for those kinds of impromptu, low-dollar transactions that you may not expect to go through a P2P process to generate a purchase order, and follow that normal approval process. It was to enable end users, specifically with what we'll call walking plastic, an actual credit card in their wallet, to occasionally go down and make that purchase from a local vendor on an ad hoc or impromptu basis. But there's been a lot of change here. One of the reasons that P-card programs often plateaued and didn't really reach their full potential is inherent in the P-card was a lack of control. That having that card in the end user's hand really was, in many cases, an invitation for a maverick purchase, for non-compliance, because they could potentially go use it at almost any supplier, so someone other than the approved contracted vendor, and perhaps making purchases for items that really aren't authorized, from a procurement standpoint. So lack of control really limited the potential application of the P-card programs. But today, the P-card and P2P are really being integrated as part of the same process. So one of the key developments here, of course, is also the fact that you could roll out a P-card through a ghosted card or a corporate card program. So that means end users don't necessarily have to have that walking plastic, that card in their wallet, but they can come through the same channel as any other requisition or create a requisition, have it go through the approval process, and get pre-approved, if you will. So unlike the card transaction, when a user goes down and plunks that card down at the merchant, you really don't have any pre-approval controls. It's really only an after-the-fact audit. The purchase has already been made. But here, the integration of P-card programs, especially with the ghosted or corporate card with P2P, means you can have that control on the front end and make sure that the purchases are authorized and appropriate. They're with the approved contracted vendors at negotiated rates. After all, if a user goes down to the corner store, they're essentially paying retail and foregoing the buying leverage that your corporation or organization has. So by integrating it into the process, you've got all the controls built in, and when you place that order with the supplier, you're able to send an instruction to charge the card instead of raising an invoice, and that may mean charging that corporate card account or ghost card account. So you also have the added benefit of taking the invoice transaction out of the process on the back end altogether, so reducing the burden on AP and maximizing the savings that you can get through card rebates, typically somewhere around 100 basis points, 1% to 1.5% of the transaction value. So there's lots of benefits across the board, and you get the best of both worlds by incorporating the control inherent in the P2P process and using the P card really as an alternate payment method to the invoice on the back end. So lots of innovation, lots of progress has been made to reconcile these two things, the card programs and P2P processes. So next question, what's the best place to start when you want to learn about this next generation P2P? You know, what are the prevailing models? What are the best practices? What are some of the best solutions that should be investigated? So I've shared a lot of data from Hackett Group, for example. That's a great resource. A number of the other analyst firms as well, Gartner, et cetera. And one of the more recent reports I'll just highlight for you, Forrester Research, has just come out with their WAVE report on e-procurement, so published actually Q2 2017 at the end of May. And they look across a number of characteristics of different providers in the space, looking at their long-term strategy as well as their current offering in the market. So you're getting a view towards what the future roadmaps are and the various providers' ability to deliver against those requirements, as well as the current offering, the strength in the market and presence. And we're very happy to say at Zycus that we're one of the leaders in the WAVE report. There are only 5 that are listed as leaders, and Zycus is included in that, and some of the kind of our scorecard in this area includes number 2 in both product and overall strategy, also very high, number 2 in supplier adoption, ease of use, requisition creation, number 3. So there are 11 vendors in total scored, and Zycus is at or near the top across a number of dimensions. So that's also a great place to start researching, looking at these kinds of market reports to get information about who the different providers are, to really understand, based on your requirements, what's the best fit for your organization. So another question here about what are the advantages of implementing a full P2P solution versus just taking on one P or the other, or perhaps phasing them in? Do I do e-procurement first and follow up with e-invoicing, or do I do one or the other? Certainly, there are a number of advantages to doing P2P in a comprehensive fashion, incorporating both e-procurement and e-invoicing because of the flow involved in this process. So if you think about e-procurement really being focused on the purchase to order phase with the requisition flowing through the approval process, generating a PO to the supplier, well, that PO is actually one of the critical enablers for AP automation on the e-invoicing side, because having a purchase order in place, first of all, demonstrates true control over spending, but also enables what we'll call a PO flip. When that supplier receives your electronic purchase order, it makes it much easier for them to turn that around, flip the line item information in the PO to generate an e-invoice back to you. So that streamlines the process on the AP side as well and reduces the potential for errors. So you're not having the information being rekeyed into an invoice and all of a sudden you get the the wrong item information or the wrong pricing, and you got an invoice mismatch. By flipping the line item information directly from the PO into the invoice, you've got a much higher percentage of accurate first pass matches on the invoices that are going to come back from the suppliers. Not only that, you've got more accurate accounting for these transactions. So embedded in the PO information at a line level is the coding of the appropriate GL code or budget code, as well as commodity codes. Now that information flows through in the AP process when you match that PO line level accounting information to the invoice for payment, so that when the invoice is approved for payment, that's when you're going to post it to the general ledger, in the financial system. So again, a much more efficient and accurate process when you've combined e-procurement and e-invoicing together. Now, naturally, there may be some reasons why an organization would just, for reasons of bandwidth, for example, decide that they need to phase the approach, maybe start with e-procurement and follow on with e-invoicing, for example. But wherever possible, there are certainly true synergies to deploying a full P2P solution. And whether you get there all at once or in a phased approach, really recommended to get that linkage because of the incremental and cumulative benefits of linking the purchase to the pay side of the transaction. So next question, sort of following on the e-invoicing theme, how many of my suppliers can I expect to convert from paper to e-invoicing? And e-invoicing is a little bit of an anomaly in North America, in particular in the U.S., because in most cases, technology adoption in the U.S. market or in North America is usually well ahead of adoption in other parts of the globe, be it Europe or Latin America or Asia Pacific. E-invoicing is the exception to that rule. They're actually, especially in Europe and Latin America, e-invoicing is much more broadly adopted today than it is in the U.S. Now, there is a good reason for that. For the most part, those countries have government mandates for e-invoicing adoption that's really driven in large part by the taxing jurisdictions and their goals to enforce VAT tax compliance, whether that's in the European countries or Latin America. So they've had a real head start because of that government nudge and mandate. Now, we don't have those same mandates in the U.S., so here the adoption has been driven really more specifically around the business case, that it makes good business sense independent of a government mandate for compliance to adopt e-invoice. And the good news is there are lots of strong arguments, a solid business case and ROI from e-invoicing adoption. So that's a little bit about where we are today. Now, the question is a good one. I might turn it around a little bit, though, because the reality is it's probably not realistic that you're going to get 100% supplier adoption of e-invoicing, because after all, your suppliers are sort of all across the map. Some very large tier 1 suppliers that are very technically sophisticated, and then you've got the small mom and pop shops on the other end, or maybe suppliers that you only use once a year or something like that. So it may not be realistic to get 100% adoption. Really, another way to look at this is what percentage of my transaction volume can I convert to electronic invoicing, because that's where the benefit's going to come from, that they're getting 80% adoption, which would be, a best-in-class type rate, would give you most of the benefit, and after that, you may actually start to see some diminishing returns in terms of the effort it takes to convert those tail suppliers to electronic invoicing. In any event, the best practice in this case is really focus on those suppliers typically the 20% of your suppliers that would account for 80% of the transactions. The good news there is also those 20% are also likely to be a little further along the technology curve, so they're more likely to be comfortable either using a standard protocol if they're already e-commerce enabled like a CXML to do electronic invoicing with you, or to utilize a portal technology or a mobile app, a number of ways for them to be able to collaborate with you electronically. But clearly a prioritization of looking at your spend data, looking at exactly which suppliers are those probably 20% that would account for 80% of the transactions, and going after those certainly in the first wave, and then in subsequent stages perhaps pushing the needle with some of the tail end suppliers, maybe never getting to 100% adoption, but realizing the vast majority of the benefits early on in the process. So good question there. Kind of keeping on the same theme, if I want to get supplier adoption, if I want to target 50%, 80% of transactions through electronic invoices instead of purely paper, or what might just as well be paper, which would be emails with attached PDF or Excel files that someone has to open and key punch in or scan or those kinds of things. So still a manual process in that case. But if I want to target true e-invoicing adoption, certainly I can try to drive adoption by fiat or mandate, just telling my suppliers thou shalt do this. And it certainly is effective to clearly communicate a strong position with your suppliers that you expect their participation, that it is essentially mandatory. But it's also helpful to have some carrots that go along with the sticks. And there is a value proposition to your suppliers. By engaging with you electronically, they're going to really help you accelerate the approval and payment process. So it's going to increase the likelihood that they get paid on time, which is always critical to suppliers because they're having to manage their own working capital. Now beyond that, electronic invoicing is often a key enabler to implement various supply chain financing or dynamic discounting programs that may be attractive to a number of your suppliers to not just get paid on time, for instance, if you have net 30-day terms, but maybe get paid early, and suppliers being willing to exchange a discount off the invoice value to improve their working capital position, maybe get paid in 10 days or even 15 or 20 days, dynamic discounting enabling those kinds of sliding scale discounting programs. But every day sooner than the standard payment terms that supplier can get paid, that reduces their cost of borrowing, improves their working capital, et cetera. So that's an opportunity. And beyond that, just the visibility that suppliers can gain. So by participating with you in the electronic invoicing, that would typically give them visibility through a portal to really track their invoice status. Has it been received? Is it in the approval cycle? Has it been scheduled for payment? And if the remittance has been created, what's the check number and what's the pay date, so that they can plan their working capital needs accordingly. So lots of benefits actually to help convince the suppliers to come on board with your e-invoicing program. So a little bit of bigger level in terms of convincing, there's a set of arguments for getting your suppliers on board. Within your organization, typically there's a business case that's the crux of the argument needed to get your project funded and green-lighted and the budget approved to do a P2P implementation, or perhaps a refresh in this P2P 2.0 stage of you know, an earlier deployment that may not be hitting the targets that you've set. And in any event, a business case is usually needed to justify return on investment. So just give you some of the core metrics here. This, again, is from some Hackett data, and I would say very conservative assumptions in this case. We'll take an organization that has $1 billion in spend, so a very large, pretty large organization. And the first assumption here is that their average non-compliance is 25% of spend. And I would say that many of the organizations that I get involved with actually are experiencing the inverse of that situation, that they may only have 25% of indirect spend compliant to contract and 75% non-compliant. So if that's the case, or even somewhere in between, the potential benefits would be dramatically higher than is shown in this illustration. But this is a very conservative case. So even in this case, with 25% non-compliance, improving that in just an incremental fashion, 20% compliance increase, can net $4 million in savings. So for every dollar that's brought into compliance, the benchmark data shows that every dollar generates an average of 8% of savings. So that's a very hard dollar benefit capture. And then you can layer on top of that a variety of efficiency gains on the order of 38% efficiency from taking the paper and the wait time and the touch time out of the requisitioning and ordering and invoice processes, and accelerating cycle time by an average of 25%, reducing the data maintenance costs. You add it all together, and even assuming, again, a conservative approach where those benefits might be phased in over 3 years at a 25% adoption in year 1, 50% set in year 2, and 75% by year 3, you could see it would be pretty straightforward and pretty easy to create a very compelling ROI for your initiative. So just some sample metrics there on building a business case. Next question that we had is, how do the P2P systems either duplicate or overlap what I'm already doing with my ERP, or complement and integrate? And it really is more of the latter. You know, ERP systems are critical enablers as systems of record, as transactional financial systems. But when it comes to P2P, we're really talking about systems of engagement, especially because the goal is to empower end users to drive high levels of adoption and compliance. And that's really not what ERP systems were designed to do. They don't typically have that kind of an intuitive end user experience that's going to encourage high levels of adoption. So really the best practice here is to use P2P tools. Gartner actually calls this phenomenon, if you will, postmodern ERP, which, you know, essentially says the core tenet of that is that at this stage of the evolution, procurement departments have plenty of empirical evidence to say we can't rely on an ERP system to manage a process like P2P or strategic sourcing or spend analytics and contract management. That those best-of-breed tools are really what's required to complement ERP. And so that's really the model that's the most prevalent in the market today that drives best-in-class type performance, is using best-of-breed tools for P2P that complement and integrate with the ERP. So being able to manage the entire purchase-to-pay process flow, but yet utilize ERP systems to bring in master data, supplier master information, charts of accounts to make sure that the accounting is done appropriately, the right approval hierarchy, and also to feed data back to ERP on the back end, so be able to post those transactions to the general ledger to complete the payment process and cash disbursement to the supplier. So it's really about the integration, and the good news in this case here is as technologies have evolved, they're much more open, so that this is typically done through standard application interfaces. It can be done through a real-time integration approach or a file-based approach, whatever is most appropriate for your organization. But the integration is certainly something that's that's accomplished much more easily, in fact, than had previously been done with more complicated type technology infrastructures. With the open technologies today, that's the best practice. So with that in mind, how long do P2P solutions take to implement? The answer, of course, is it depends. Isn't that always the answer? But we're not talking about, again, let's contrast the ERP implementations and rollouts that can often take, not many months, but maybe years in many cases. And of course, the footprint is so big that there are a number of reasons for that. When it comes to P2P solutions, these can be accomplished in 3 to 6 months. And it's really a matter of scale and scope. So in some cases, that initial implementation period may be for a defined geography, for example. So the best practice is really not big bang, especially for a very large global organization. It may be much more appropriate to do a phased implementation and rollout. So that first 3 to 6 months period may be in a specific geography to get the solution up and running, and then be able to replicate it and adjust for different local requirements and nuances in the second phase of a global rollout. But that's the expectation. And in terms of the resources required, one of the real advantages of the cloud-based phenomenon is you're dramatically reducing the internal resource requirement, especially from an IT standpoint, because after all, you're not having to provision the hardware, the servers to install and test the software and provision users and all those kinds of things. All of that's taken care of by the cloud provider, but IT involvement is not negligible either. It's critical. It's minimized because of the cloud solution, but critical to be able to provide access, especially around the integration approach to the core ERP. So the resources needed from the organization would include some IT support, as well as, of course, a project manager that would be more or less dedicated during the initial implementation, whose time allocation would certainly ramp down on a steady state basis, but also really important to have the right subject matter experts involved, particularly on the front end of the process, to help with the requirements and process definition. So experts on the procurement process, on the payables and AP process, the finance stakeholders are critical to this initiative as well, and as I already mentioned, IT. So it won't be an extensive time requirement for those subject matter experts, but really critical that their involvement be at the right point, which is early and upfront in the process, to make sure that your stakeholders are bought in, that all their requirements are accounted for. It's really going to be key to success later on in the process. So another question here about best practices in maintaining logs of payments. So this really gets to the notion that I mentioned earlier about one of the real points of leverage with a portal-based technology that allows secure access on the part of your suppliers is you're going to be able to give them visibility on a self-service basis to things like payments. So just to illustrate the point here around some of the best practices, and again, this data comes from Hackett Group, but of course the type of questions generated about payments, both from suppliers as well as sometimes the requesters internally that may be inquiring on behalf of the suppliers is, did you get my invoice? When am I going to get paid? What's the status? How do I update my bank details to make sure that you're sending me the payment? Hopefully, an ACH or an EFT type electronic banking transaction instead of a paper check. All these questions come up, and the best practice is, of course, here a number of the things I've already mentioned. Being able to enable suppliers to maintain their own master data around their profile that includes banking information, to be able to do that PO flip, to make that process of turning the PO into an electronic invoice much more seamless, and then also having 24/7 transparent visibility to be able to track their own invoice approval and payment status. And some of the benefits, of course, taking the paper out of the process, 42% reduction in the number of paper invoices, lower invoice processing costs, and almost a quarter less time spent, especially on the part of AP, just in responding to supplier inquiries. So think about that payment log being now available 24/7 on a secure access basis by suppliers coming in self-service, all the efficiency gains both on your side as well as the suppliers. And the final question we have for the office hours today, and lots of great questions, appreciate everyone submitting those, is kind of looking ahead as we think about the evolution of P2P 2.0 and beyond. Certainly the potential is there to dramatically change the task, the day-to-day work effort within the procurement function, because after all, if I've truly enabled self-service procure-to-pay for end-user requisitioners as well as suppliers, now all of a sudden if I'm in either procurement or AP, I'm spending far less time, hopefully a very small fraction of my time, on those tactical or transactional processes, managing requisitions or POs or invoices. I'm digitizing the process. I'm automating the approval workflows and the matching process. I'm really going to spend far less time on those activities. So what does my job description look like in the future? And I think the good news is it's going to be much more attractive to professionals both in procurement and AP, because now I'm going to be freed up to be more strategic and more analytical. And that also is going to change the skill set requirement. So from a technical standpoint, certainly the procurement and AP professionals of the future have to be comfortable with the latest technologies. And as the demographics change in the workforce, for instance, there's a new generation of, especially the millennials, that have been raised on these types of technologies, be it Facebook, Amazon, those kinds of things, social networking. So they don't have to be technical in nature, but they have to be proficient and comfortable utilizing the technology, and it's going to therefore place more of a premium on having the analytic skills to derive insights based on this newfound availability of data. And even more importantly, I would say, having the business acumen and relationship management skills to take those insights that procurement starts to get, better spend data visibility, better information about the process benchmarks and performance, and be able to engage the business, their customers, the end users or stakeholders or budget holders, around strategic discussions about how they can add value to their business. So spending more time on strategic supplier management, category management and sourcing, driving positive business outcomes and strategic value instead of spending a disproportionate amount of time on these kinds of tactical or transactional activities. So those are all the questions that I had for the office hours today. Didn't quite take up a full hour of your time, but wanted to thank everyone for providing the questions. I think great questions, and hopefully there's some valuable information to help formulate your strategies and plans as you look forward towards what P2P needs to be to deliver the kind of performance that your organization is targeting. And we'd like to invite everyone to join us again for future episodes, if you will, of our office hours. It's a chance for us to address those top-of-mind questions that folks have out there driving towards the best possible procurement performance. So thanks, everyone, for joining today for office hours.